August 1211. Situated in Wanazui Pass within the Yan Mountains of northern China, Chancellor Wan Chongyu surveys the scene from a ridge overlooking the narrow chasm known as Badger's Mouth. Below him, stretching across the vast mountainous landscape, 400,000 Jin soldiers are arrayed in their defensive positions. This immense force, comprising the entirety of the Jin Dynasty's northern field army, the most formidable empire in East Asia, is dispersed for miles across peaks and valleys. He observes detachments of Ursian heavy cavalry on the western inclines and Khitan horsemen securing the eastern passages. Masses of Han Chinese infantry occupy the crucial central bottlenecks. The constricted passes twist among the peaks like a network of veins, and Wan Chongyu has strategically deployed his troops to control each one. This, he believes, is the decisive moment to halt the Mongol incursion. The mountains, unlike the open steppes, will negate the superior mobility of the Mongol horsemen. Here, their cavalry charges and hit-and-run tactics will prove futile in terrain offering no escape. The passes are too narrow for their steeds, and the slopes too precipitous for their rapid maneuvers. Even if they breach one position, 10 more lie in wait behind it. With 400,000 men in an ideal defensive setup, Wan Chongyu feels entirely justified in his confidence. Then, from the valley below, a sound pierces the air, the echoing boom of Mongol war drums against the mountain walls. Subsequently, he witnesses an utterly inexplicable sight. The Mongol cavalry, as anticipated, approaches the mountain base. But then they halt and, astonishingly, dismount. The world's premier light cavalry is abandoning their horses, forming up on foot. They intend to assault a mountain pass as infantry against 400,000 defenders, with an estimated total force of 100,000 men. It appears suicidal. Wan Chongyu nearly laughs. The Mongols then charge uphill on foot with a frenzied intensity, assailing the central Jin positions at Hanazui with their full might. Waves of dismounted cavalry surge uphill into a prepared defensive stronghold. The Jin center responds as any army would, fiercely resisting the assault. For a time, it seems their strategy is working. The Jin troops hold their ground, and the mountains fulfill their protective role. However, Wan Chongyu soon detects a critical flaw. The units on the western ridge are not advancing to bolster the center, nor are those on the eastern slopes. He dispatches runners with orders for reinforcement. But these messengers must traverse miles of treacherous mountain trails to reach the other units. By the time they arrive, the situation has dramatically shifted. The central commander at Hanazui, Field Marshal Wan Jujin, sends desperate pleas for assistance. Yet, the messages take so long to arrive that by the time reinforcements begin to move, it's already too late. The Mongols breach the center, Wan Jujin is killed, and the central positions crumble. Suddenly, 400,000 men, scattered across numerous mountain valleys, find themselves disoriented, unable to communicate with each other, and lacking central command. Some units attempt to advance toward the conflict, others try to maintain their positions, and still others attempt to retreat. None can ascertain the actions of their comrades. The very mountains intended for protection now act as isolating barriers. The Jin army doesn't merely lose, it disintegrates. Men fleeing through mountain passes are hunted down by pursuing Mongols. Units surrender only to be massacred. Entire formations simply vanish into the valleys, never to be seen again. When the battle concludes, corpses litter the mountains for over 100 miles. Not 100 individuals, not 100 yards of bodies, but 100 miles. Of the 400,000 soldiers who entered those mountains, perhaps only 50,000 emerged. This raises a crucial question. How could 100,000 dismounted Mongols annihilate 400,000 defenders in terrain specifically designed to stop them? Or, why did the Jin Dynasty's seemingly perfect mountain fortress transform into the deadliest trap in medieval Chinese history? And what intelligence did a Khitan defector provide Genghis Khan that turned an empire's greatest strategic asset into its downfall? By the end of this account, you will grasp a profound insight often overlooked in military history. Sometimes, an abundance of assets, more troops, greater defensive advantages, more meticulously prepared positions, can paradoxically render an army weaker, not stronger. Sometimes, victory goes to the side that adapts most rapidly, even when outnumbered 4-1. And occasionally, an impeccable strategy fails because one never anticipates that the most trusted individual might decide one deserves a painful downfall. This is the Battle of Yehuling. This is the day Genghis Khan shattered the Jin Dynasty. And this is the narrative of how the mountains betrayed the very army that sought refuge behind them. Let's rewind 2 years to the meeting that sealed an empire's fate in 1210. A messenger from the Jin Dynasty approaches the Mongol encampments, carrying an announcement from the newly crowned emperor Wanyan Yongji, who ascended the throne merely 2 years prior. The message is straightforward. Acknowledge your subservience to the Jin emperor, pay your tributes, and understand your subordinate position. This protocol has been in effect perpetually. For numerous decades, the Jin Dynasty had exerted authority over the various Mongol tribes through a strategy known as "zero." They fostered competition among the tribes, promoted rivalries, collected taxes, and whenever a tribe gained too much influence or consolidated power, they dispatched punitive expeditions northward to demonstrate who truly held sway. They executed Mongol leaders and enslaved Mongol families, essentially treating the steppes as their personal hunting grounds to assert their dominance. Consequently, upon the envoy's arrival, anticipating the customary capitulation, he was likely unprepared for the ensuing events. Genghis Khan, who had devoted the last 4 years to unifying every Mongol tribe under his dominion, having recently vanquished the rival Tatars to the east and subjugated the Ongud tribe in the Western Sea Kingdom, addresses the Jin envoy with words that would echo for 800 years. He declares, "The Jin emperor is a coward and unfit to lead." He further states, and I convey this precisely as historical records detail, "The emperor ought to be a divine figure like myself." The envoy is astonished, but Genghis Khan has not concluded. He turns southward, facing Jin territory, and spits upon the ground. Then, without uttering another sound, he mounts his horse and rides northward, leaving the Jin envoy, as one chronicle describes, choking in his dust. When Emperor Wan Yongji receives intelligence of this incident, his fury is so profound that he immediately executes the Mongol ambassador. Tensions rise, and war becomes unavoidable. Yet it's crucial to grasp that this altercation transcended a mere insult. It stemmed from something far more ancient and deeply personal. Let's rewind to the mid-12th century, likely between 1148 and 1156. A Mongol chieftain named Ambagai Khan embarks on a journey to arrange a marital alliance with a Tatar clan. Ambagai, an ancestor of Genghis Khan and the Khan of the unified Mongol tribes, intended this marriage to cement relationships between different Mongol groups. However, the Tatars had collaborated with the Jin Dynasty for years, and the Jin had explicitly stated their opposition to Mongol unification and empowerment. Thus, when Ambagai arrives for the wedding, the Tatars apprehend him, not during a battle or a raid, but under the guise of hospitality during peace negotiations, and subsequently hand him over to the Jin Dynasty. The Jin transport Ambagai to their capital at Zhongdu, contemporary Beijing, where Emperor Shizong of Jin orchestrates an execution designed to send a stark warning to all Mongol tribes. This is the consequence of attempting to unite against us. They crucify Ambagai on a wooden mule, essentially nailing him to a donkey-shaped wooden frame, and then hack him to death while he is still alive. The execution is public, brutal, and humiliating. For the Mongols, this became an unhealing wound. Genghis Khan grew up with tales of his ancestors' murder by the Jin. He heard about the frequent punitive expeditions where Jin soldiers rode north to kill or enslave Mongols. He witnessed the Jin pitting Mongol tribes against each other, ensuring their weakness, division, and control. And when he finally united all the Mongol tribes in 1206, assuming the title Genghis Khan and becoming the leader of a unified Mongol nation, he knew precisely how he would wield that power. In March 1211, by the Karelin River in Mongolia, Genghis Khan convenes every Mongol chieftain for a kurultai, a grand assembly. He spends 4 days alone on a nearby mountain, praying to Tengri, the eternal blue sky. In an act of ritual humility, he removes his hat and belt, bows before heaven, and recounts generation by generation every grievance the Mongol people hold against the Jin Dynasty. The divide and conquer tactics, the punitive raids, the enslaved families, and above all, the torture and murder of Ambagai Khan. On the 4th day, Genghis Khan descends from the mountain with a decree. The eternal blue sky has guaranteed us triumph and retribution. He mobilizes 90% of the entire Mongol military, comprising 100,000 cavalry. They leave only approximately 2,000 men to safeguard Mongolia. This represents absolute dedication. It is their entire commitment. Before riding south, Genghis Khan pledges to avenge his ancestor and obliterate the Jin Dynasty. When news of the impending invasion reaches the Jin court, Emperor Wanyan Yongji dispatches a message that perfectly encapsulates the hubris that is about to lead to the destruction of his empire. He states, quote, "On paper, he possesses every ground for confidence. The Jin Dynasty commands 800,000 troops, 150,000 heavy cavalry, and a reserve of 6 million potential recruits. They commanded the entirety of northern China, a region renowned for its wealth and population density across the globe. They had conquered the Khitan Liao dynasty and successfully repelled the Song dynasty, establishing themselves as the dominant military force in East Asia for a century. In contrast, the Mongols were nomadic horsemen from the steppes, numbering around 100,000 riders, devoid of cities, fortifications, or agricultural heartlands for supply lines. Just men, horses, and the vast open sky. What possible threats could they pose? In the spring of 1211, Genghis Khan's army traversed the Gobi Desert, entering what is now Inner Mongolia. Before them lay the Jin Dynasty's Great Wall, a different defensive structure than the renowned Ming Dynasty wall visited by tourists today. This earlier version, roughly 300 kilometers long, was fortified with watchtowers and fortresses, specifically designed to deter steppe cavalry from infiltrating northern China. The most heavily fortified location was Zhang Pass, the direct route to the Jin capital at Zhongdu, defended by thousands of soldiers and formidable barriers. A direct assault would be suicidal, a tactic Genghis Khan didn't even consider. Instead, he dispatched scouts to meticulously survey the entire wall for weeks, mapping every fortress, garrison, and patrol route. His scouts ultimately discovered what he sought: the system's weakest link. This was Wu'er Fortress, which opened onto a desert ridge known locally as Yehuling, or Wild Fox Ridge, due to its sparse population of wild foxes. It was lightly defended because no army was expected to approach through such desolate terrain. This was perfect. Genghis Khan divided his forces. He sent his third son, Ogedei, with approximately 30,000 riders to assault Shijin, the Jin's western capital, currently known as Datong. Ogedei's mission was straightforward: create a diversion, attract attention, and crucially, prevent any reinforcements from reaching the primary Jin army. Concurrently, Genghis Khan led the main force, comprising 60,000 to 70,000 cavalry, directly towards Wu'er Fortress. Duji Si Zhang, the Jin chancellor responsible for the northwest frontier's defense, made a decision still analyzed by military historians as a prime example of ineffective perimeter defense. Rather than consolidating his 30,000 to 50,000 troops into a mobile unit capable of responding to breaches, he spread them thinly along the entire wall. His attempt to defend every point left him unable to properly defend any. When the Mongols struck Wu'er Fortress and the adjacent Wu'er camp, Duji Sijong's dispersed forces could not regroup swiftly enough to prevent the breakthrough. The Mongols shattered the defensive line, seized Wuwa camp, and killed Chancellor Duji Sijong in the ensuing conflict. Most of his army was annihilated. By late June 1211, the Mongols had breached the Great Wall, and the Jin Dynasty's initial line of defense had fallen. Panic gripped the Jin capital. The main defensive line had collapsed, and the Mongols were now freely roaming Jin territory. A new commander and strategy were urgently required. Yan Changyu was promoted to chancellor. After assessing the situation, he conceived what he believed was a tactical stroke of genius. He ordered the evacuation of 3 prosperous Jin cities, Hengha, Changha, and Fuzhou. These were not minor cities. They were the heart of the Jin Dynasty's horse-breeding industry, home to imperial herding grounds where tens of thousands of high-quality warhorses were bred annually. Yan Changyu's rationale was that he needed to concentrate his forces. Holding scattered cities would only dilute his strength. He believed everyone should retreat to a single, formidable defensive position where the Mongols could not outmaneuver him. Consequently, he abandoned the cities, and the Mongols entered, seizing every single horse, tens of thousands of China's finest warhorses, specifically bred for conflict. These were horses that the Jin Dynasty had invested decades and immense resources in developing. The Mongols, engaged in a mobile campaign across China and desperately needing fresh horses to replace those exhausted from their Gobi crossing, were effectively handed the Jin Dynasty's strategic reserve. Consider this irony. The Jin Dynasty was attempting to defend against horse nomads, whose entire military system relied on vast numbers of horses. Yet the Jin's opening move was to voluntarily supply them with tens of thousands of warhorses. This was justified by the belief that consolidating forces was more critical than denying the enemy resources. However, Yan Changyu was focused on the larger strategic picture. He contemplated the 400,000 troops he was amassing at the Yehuling mountain pass, the natural strategic bottleneck between Mongolia and Beijing. He envisioned how the mountains would impede the Mongol cavalry, how the constricted passes would safeguard his flanks, and how his overwhelming numerical advantage would crush any force attempting to break through. The Mongols spent approximately a month recuperating following the battle at Wuwa. They allowed their horses to grow strong on the abundant grass found in the abandoned Jin grazing lands. Their troops were given time to recuperate. They observed and waited while Chancellor Yan Changyu assembled his colossal army at Yehuling. Then, once fully prepared, they advanced southward towards the mountain pass, where an impressive force of 400,000 Jin soldiers awaited them. On paper, this scenario appeared destined for a massacre. The Jin possessed a quadrupled numerical advantage. They occupied pre-established defensive fortifications. They were fighting on their native soil. They benefited from superior internal supply lines and strategic positioning. Every conceivable factor favored them. However, Genghis Khan possessed knowledge that Yan Changyu lacked. He understood that at times, the largest army, entrenched in the most impeccable defensive posture, could be among the easiest to dismantle. He recognized that mountains pose an obstacle not only to an invading force, but also to the defenders. Furthermore, he was acutely aware that 400,000 soldiers necessitated feeding 400,000 mouths, managing 400,000 men requiring instructions, and confronting 400,000 potential vulnerabilities. Most significantly, he was on the verge of receiving crucial intelligence from someone privy to the exact locations of these weaknesses. Let's delve into Yan Changyu's strategy, for on paper, it demonstrated true brilliance. The man was far from foolish. He was confronted with a military predicament and responded with sound tactical judgment. The Mongols were cavalry. Their entire military apparatus was predicated on swift movement, mounted archery, rapid strikes and retreats, and the capacity to outmaneuver slower adversaries on open terrain. They had conquered the western Xia kingdom. They had vanquished the Tartars. They had breached the Jin's defensive lines at Wuwa. Their victories stemmed from their superior speed and mobility compared to all others. Consequently, Yuan Changyu selected terrain that negated this Mongol advantage. He concentrated his forces at Yehuling, a mountain pass within the Yan Mountains, situated northwest of Beijing. This was the natural invasion route from Mongolia to the Jin capital. Crucially, it was a terrain anathema to cavalry operations. The landscape comprised rugged peaks and constricted valleys. The passes meandered through the mountains like arteries, with Yuan Changyu's chosen specific location being Hanazui, or Badger's Mouth Pass, the most constricted bottleneck in the entire range. He amassed 400,000 men, a staggering 400,000. Let that number truly resonate. This exceeded the number of U.S. troops in Iraq at the height of the surge. It approximated the full might of the Roman Empire's military at its zenith. And Yuan Changyu deployed this colossal force at a single defensive position, meticulously selected to nullify enemy cavalry. The underlying logic seemed unassailable. Mongol cavalry could not charge in mountainous terrain. They could not execute flanking maneuvers in narrow passes. Their superior mobility was rendered useless when the topography constrained everyone's movement. The passes safeguarded the Jin's flanks. The Mongols were unable to circumvent their positions from behind. The mountains provided elevated ground for archers and defensible locations. Even if, against all odds, the Mongols breached one position, multiple fallback lines lay in wait. 400,000 men in defensive territory, fighting to protect their homeland against 100,000 invaders who were deprived of their primary tactical edge. From Yuan Changyu's perspective, he had resolved the Mongol dilemma. He had rendered their primary strength irrelevant. He had utilized his own advantages, immense numbers, heavy infantry, prepared positions, and deployed them in terrain where they were most effective. This was textbook defensive warfare. However, there's a critical caveat concerning textbook defensive warfare. It presupposes specific conditions that often do not hold true in actuality. The first issue: it is physically impossible to accommodate 400,000 men within a single mountain pass. The necessary physical space simply doesn't exist. As a result, Yuan Changyu's 400,000 troops were dispersed across dozens of peaks and valleys. Some units were separated by miles, isolated by ridges, gorges, and terrain so arduous that moving between positions consumed hours. Yes, they were all positioned at Yehuling, but Yehuling was not a singular location. Rather, it was a network of positions sprawling across miles of mountainous territory. The second problem involved communication. In 1211, relaying a message from one unit to another meant dispatching a runner, either mounted or on foot. If these units were separated by miles of mountain trails, that message required considerable time to reach its destination. Perhaps an hour, perhaps several hours. The runner might become lost, delayed, or even killed. By the time the message finally arrived, the tactical situation could have completely transformed. One would be issuing orders based on information that was already outdated. The third difficulty lay in coordination. Consider a scenario where the central position came under assault and required reinforcements. The units on the flanks would eventually receive the message and begin marching to assist, but they would have to navigate treacherous mountain paths. They couldn't see the ongoing battle. They wouldn't know if the central position had already fallen or was still resisting. They wouldn't know if they were advancing into an ambush. They were unaware of what the other flank units were doing. Everyone would be operating blindly, making decisions based on incomplete information that could be hours old. The fourth issue was that the mountainous landscape impeded everyone. While the Mongols were unable to deploy their cavalry, the Jin faced the same limitation. The very terrain restricting Mongol movement similarly constrained that of the Jin. However, the critical difference lay in the Mongols being a smaller, more unified force, capable of concentrating its efforts, whereas the Jin represented a vast, dispersed army requiring space and clear communication to function effectively. The fifth and most crucial problem was that the Jin Dynasty was not a culturally homogeneous entity. It was a multi-ethnic empire. Its rulers, the Jurchens, constituted a minority group from Manchuria who had conquered northern China approximately a century prior. The army comprised not only elite Jin troops, but also Khitan cavalry units, Han Chinese infantry, and conscripted peasants drawn from a multitude of ethnic backgrounds. The Khitans, in particular, harbored complex sentiments about serving the Jin, given that the Jurchens had overthrown the Khitan's Liao dynasty in 1125, a mere 86 years before. This army included Khitan soldiers whose grandfathers had fought against the Jurchens, and Khitan officers who remembered when their people governed northern China, and the Jurchens were the subjugated population. The Jin dynasty attempted to manage this situation through typical imperial subjugation, controlling the Khitan people via a blend of integration and intimidation. They granted some Khitans bureaucratic and military positions, yet also brutally suppressed Khitan uprisings in 1161 and 1164, seizing horses and forcing rebels into agriculture. They also engaged in a practice described by sources as quote, _5__, compelling Khitan women, including the wives of Khitan aristocrats, to serve Jurchen nobility. This fostered a deep-seated resentment that would not simply vanish because everyone now wore the same uniform. Thus, when Wan Chengyu surveyed his 400,000 troops and perceived strength in numbers, he was, in reality, observing a fragile alliance held together by imperial authority and the threat of punishment. As long as that central authority remained present and robust, it was effective. Yet in the mountains, with units separated by miles, communication breakdown, and no one grasping the broader situation, that central authority became theoretical rather than concrete. Wan Chengyu anticipated the mountains would halt the Mongols, but he failed to grasp that the mountains would also prevent him from utilizing his 400,000 troops efficiently. He had established an ideal defensive position for an army that didn't exist, a unified, well-coordinated force with flawless communication and absolute loyalty. The army he actually possessed was scattered, disorganized, and filled with soldiers who, at best, had ambivalent feelings about dying for Jurchen overlords. However, he was oblivious to all of this. At that moment, in the summer of 1211, he observed his deployed forces with confidence. The Mongols were approaching, the trap was set. All he had to do was wait. And then the Jin Dynasty made the worst possible decision. They chose to send a negotiator to the Mongol encampment. The Mongols reached the plain below Yehuling sometime in late July or early August 1211. Then, unexpectedly, they stopped. They did not attack, nor did they probe the defenses or send raiders to harass the Jin positions. They simply encamped on the open plain and waited. Days turned into weeks. The Mongol army remained visible from the Jin positions, and Genghis Khan made no move to assault the mountains. Wan Chengyu observed this, convinced he understood the situation. The Mongols, he believed, had assessed the mountain defenses and concluded that a frontal assault was unwinnable. They were attempting to lure the Jin army onto the open plain, where Mongol cavalry could operate effectively. It seemed obvious, transparent, and Wan Chengyu wasn't falling for it. He kept his 400,000 men in the mountains, awaiting the Mongols' surrender or exhaustion of supplies. What Wan Chengyu did not know was that Genghis Khan was awaiting something very specific: intelligence. He was aware a massive Jin army was hidden in those mountains, but he needed to know their precise location, deployment, weaknesses, and command structure. One does not attack a fortified position blindly. Information must be gathered first. The stalemate persisted for weeks, until the Jin court made a decision. They would dispatch an envoy to the Mongol camp. Officially, the mission was to reprimand Genghis Khan for his aggression and demand his withdrawal. Unofficially, it was an intelligence-gathering operation. The envoy was tasked with observing the Mongol camp, assessing their numbers and morale, discerning their plans, and reporting back to the Jin command. They selected a man named Shimoming An, a mid-level official in the Jin bureaucracy. He had previous experience on diplomatic missions, understood how to interact with steppe nomads, and critically, he was Khitan. Let's delve into the significance of the Khitan people and why Mingan's ethnicity was crucial. The Khitan people established the Liao dynasty in 9007, ruling northern China for over 2 centuries, stretching from Mongolia through Manchuria and into the North China Plain. They were the dominant regional power, extracting tribute from the Song dynasty and controlling the 16 prefectures, a critical buffer zone between the nomadic steppes and agricultural China. They were a sophisticated, powerful, and successful civilization. However, in 1115, the Jurchens, who had been subordinates under Khitan rule, revolted and founded the Jin Dynasty. Over the following decade, they systematically dismantled the Liao dynasty and conquered all of northern China. By 1125, the Liao dynasty was no more, and the Khitan people were absorbed into the Jin Empire. Some fled westward, establishing the Kara Khitai kingdom in Central Asia, but most remained, becoming subjects of their former vassals. The Jurchens attempted to integrate the Khitan into their empire, granting some Khitan nobles bureaucratic positions and incorporating Khitan cavalry units into the Jin military. Yet, they consistently reinforced their dominance. When Khitan uprisings erupted in 1161 and 1164, the Jin brutally suppressed them. They confiscated Khitan horses to force rebels into farming rather than cavalry raiding. Sources specifically detail the systematic humiliation of Khitan aristocratic families, including the forced sexual servitude of Khitan women to Jurchen officials and nobility. Therefore, when Shimeon rides to the Mongol camp in the summer of 1211, he is a Khitan man serving Jurchen lords. He belongs to a people who once governed northern China, but now live under the control of those they once dominated. He has witnessed 86 years of Jurchen rule, understands the fate of Khitan rebels, and is acutely aware of his place in the Jin Empire's ethnic hierarchy. Then he encounters Genghis Khan. While the exact details of their conversation are unrecorded, the outcome is clear. Genghis Khan makes his proposition. Quote _ 6 _ Shimeon evaluates the situation. He sees 100,000 disciplined and unified Mongol cavalry, led by a man who spent 5 years conquering all opposition. He knows the Jin possess 400,000 troops at Yehuling, but he also recognizes their scattered positions in the mountains, plagued by poor communication and coordination. He realizes the Jin army is a fragile alliance of ethnic groups with little mutual affection. He perceives the Jurchen rulers as arrogant and complacent. Through his calculations, he concludes that the Jin dynasty is doomed. This Mongol army will triumph. The only question remains: whose side does Shimeon choose? He defects on the spot. The man sent by the Jin to gather intelligence on the Mongols switches allegiance, providing crucial information about the Jin to the Mongols. And what invaluable intelligence it is! Shimeon possesses complete knowledge, the precise locations of Jin units at Yehuling, distinguishing elite Jin troops from unreliable conscripts, the communication breakdowns among dispersed units, and the weak point in the Jin defensive line, the central positions at Hanuzui Pass. He knows the names and reputations of the Jin commanders, identifying Field Marshal Wan Ju Jin as the leader of the center, and recognizing the questionable morale among non-Jin troops. He even knows the escape routes should the Jin army collapse. Genghis Khan now has a full intelligence brief on the enemy's defensive posture. He knows precisely where to strike, who guards which point, and what will happen when that position buckles. The Jin dispatched Shimeon to spy on the Mongols. Instead, the Mongols received a comprehensive map of Jin vulnerabilities, delivered by the Jin's own emissary. The irony is almost poetic. The Jin dynasty built a multi-ethnic empire through subjugation and oppression. They employed divide-and-conquer tactics to control their subject peoples, relying on ethnic minorities like the Khitan for their bureaucracy and military, due to their administrative and military expertise. Now, at this critical juncture, one of those very ethnic minorities has decided that the Jurchens deserve their impending fate. This is the consequence of constructing an empire through conquest and expecting the subjugated to defend their conquerors. This is what transpires when a population is oppressed for 86 years and then entrusted with crucial intelligence missions. This is the outcome when your greatest asset, a diverse, multi-ethnic empire with access to various populations' talents, becomes your fatal flaw, because none of those populations actually desire your victory. Shimo Mingan's switch of allegiance isn't merely a strategic military intelligence gain. It articulates a political commentary on the inherent instability of empires founded on tyranny. This act is about to precipitate the deaths of 400,000 individuals. It's August 1211. Genghis Khan possesses all requisite information. He's privy to the Jin dispositions and their vulnerabilities. He knows Marshal Wanju Jin commands the central forces. He understands that a breach in the center will prevent flank units from coordinating a defense, as the mountainous terrain isolates them. He has pinpointed the precise strike location and foresees the consequences. His target? Huanhui Pass, also known as Badger's Mouth, the most constricted choke point within the entire Yehuling defense line. This is where Commander Wanju Jin has established his central headquarters, forming the linchpin of the whole defensive arrangement. Should it endure, the Jin defensive perimeter remains intact. If it crumbles, 400,000 soldiers will fragment into uncoordinated groups. The Mongol cavalry approaches the mountain base and then executes a maneuver that likely convinces Wanju Jin of an early victory. They dismount. The world's elite light cavalry, horsemen who have triumphed from Western Sha to the Jin Dynasty's periphery, abandon their mounts to form infantry units. They intend to assault a fortified mountain pass on foot. Consider the Jin defenders' perspective. These are the formidable Mongol horsemen, the unyielding cavalry, who have just relinquished their defining advantage. They are poised to advance uphill against entrenched defenses, without horses, mobility, or the tactical versatility that has secured all their previous victories. This should be a massacre, an effortless triumph. The Mongols charge uphill, unleashing their full force against the central Jin positions at Hanazui. Waves of dismounted Mongol warriors surge uphill, braving arrow fire and prepared fortifications, confronting an enemy that outnumbers them and holds the elevated ground. Crucially, the Jin forces resist fiercely. This isn't a narrative where defenders succumb to panic and flee. The Jin soldiers at the center are seasoned professionals, many drawn from elite units. They are proficient in their duties and steadfastly maintain their positions. For hours, it appears the mountains are fulfilling their intended role as envisioned by Yan Chongyu. However, fissures begin to appear. The Mongols persist, wave after wave of assaults, showing no signs of breaking, slowing, or succumbing to exhaustion or low morale. The constant pressure starts to erode the Jin defenders' resolve. Commander Wanju Jin, directing from the central positions, recognizes the urgent need for reinforcements. He requires units from the western ridge and formations from the eastern slopes to converge and support the center. He dispatches runners with desperate pleas for assistance. These couriers must navigate miles of arduous mountain trails, locate specific reinforcement units, deliver the message, and await commanders to issue orders that then filter down to the troops before they can commence movement. In open terrain, such a process takes minutes. In mountainous regions, with units dispersed across peaks and valleys, devoid of line of sight between positions, it consumes hours. By the time reinforcements commence their journey toward the center, the situation has dramatically shifted. The Mongols have relentlessly pounded the central positions. The Jin defenders are depleted, their morale withered by the incessant attacks. Then, the Mongol line breaks through. It's not a sudden, dramatic collapse or a cinematic moment of heroic charge and immediate surrender. It's a slow disintegration. The Jin line at Huanhui initially bends, then cracks. Small groups of defenders begin retreating without orders, realizing that remaining means certain death. Larger groups follow, and the pullback escalates into a full retreat, which ultimately devolves into a rout. Field Marshal Wan Ju-jin perishes in the battle. The historical accounts offer no specifics regarding his demise, but he falls as the central position collapses. With him, the central command structure disintegrates. The Jin troops at Huanazhui are now a leaderless mob, attempting to retreat through mountain passes while being relentlessly pursued by Mongol warriors who are exceptionally adept at killing fleeing combatants. It is at this juncture that the mountains betray the Jin Dynasty. Reinforcements from the western ridge are still en route to the center, miles away, completely unaware of the center's fall. Units on the eastern slopes struggle to coordinate, unable to perceive the unfolding events. The information carried by runners is already outdated by the time it reaches its recipients. Some units advance towards the former location of the center. Some attempt to hold their current ground. Others begin withdrawing to predetermined fallback positions. Each unit remains unaware of the actions of the others. The Jin forces didn't suffer one major defeat. Instead, they engaged in numerous minor skirmishes, each disconnected, relying on incomplete or outdated intelligence, and incapable of providing mutual aid or coordination. The Jin defensive barrier crumbled progressively, segment by segment. The Mongols advanced through the valleys, trapping retreating Jin soldiers in narrow passes with no room for evasion. They overwhelmed isolated outposts, still attempting to resist, oblivious to the army's overall collapse. They even slaughtered Jin units that had surrendered hours prior, fulfilling Genghis Khan's clear directive for a war of retribution. Historical accounts suggest the deceased bodies stretched over 100 miles. This isn't a figure of speech. It refers to 100 li, approximately 50 kilometers, spanning from the Yehuling pass system all the way to Beijing. The Jin army didn't just lose a battle. It disintegrated across 50 kilometers of mountainous terrain, leaving cadavers in every ravine, on every path, and at every failed defensive post. 400,000 men entered those mountains. While sources differ on the exact number of fatalities, estimates range from 200,000 to 400,000. Opting for a conservative estimate, 200,000 perished in a single day. This figure exceeds double the American casualties throughout the entire Vietnam War, representing the eradication of a major city's population. The critical factor behind this outcome wasn't Mongol superiority or advanced weaponry, training, or secret tactics. It was Wan Chongyu's fundamental misapprehension of how mountainous environments impact armies. Mountains impede more than just cavalry. They obstruct all movement, communication, coordination, and mutual support. A small, unified army can remain concentrated and cohesive in mountains. However, a massive army in such terrain must disperse. This dispersion undermines its ability to act as a single entity, fragmenting it into independent components unable to assist one another. Wan Changyu perceived 400,000 troops as strength, when he should have recognized them as 400,000 individuals requiring sustenance, directives, situational awareness, and mutual assistance. On open ground, effective command structures, couriers, and visual cues can manage this. In mountains, it's impossible. The very terrain that hinders the enemy also prevents one's own forces from utilizing their numerical advantage effectively. The Mongols triumphed by adapting. When cavalry tactics were unsuitable, they fought as infantry. When mobility was constrained, they applied concentrated force. When they couldn't outflank, they breached the center, letting disarray complete the job. Their strategy was singular, universally understood, and flawlessly executed. They mercilessly exploited every success. The Jin lost because their supposed strength became their Achilles heel. Their 400,000 troops turned into 400,000 isolated targets. Their ideal defensive terrain became a trap that prevented mutual support. Their multi-ethnic army faltered when ethnic minorities demonstrated insufficient commitment to Jin survival to perish in those mountains. By the evening of that August day in 1211, the Jin Dynasty's northern field army was obliterated. Not merely defeated or repelled, but gone. The route to Beijing lay completely open. One might assume that after annihilating 200,000 to 400,000 Jin soldiers in a single day, Genghis Khan would pause to consolidate gains, rest his forces, and secure supply lines. This assumption would be incorrect. This was a man who had traversed the Gobi Desert for months to avenge his ancestors, and his thirst for vengeance against Jin soldiers was far from sated. In September 1211, Chancellor Wan Chongyu, the architect of Yehuling's supposed impregnable defenses, miraculously survived the mountain massacre. He managed to rally a scattered remnant, perhaps 50,000 or even 100,000 men, sources are inconclusive, leading them south to a fortress named Huhe. His aim was to regroup, establish a new defensive line, and salvage something from the catastrophe. Genghis Khan pursued relentlessly, offering no respite, no negotiations, no opportunity for the Jin to recover. The Mongols trailed the retreating Jin army to Huhe fortress and encircled it. By October, they were in position and the siege began. This was no prolonged siege of attrition. The Mongols launched an immediate assault. For 3 days, they assailed the Jin positions around Huhe. The Jin troops fought with desperation, fully aware of the fate awaiting soldiers who surrendered to an army driven by vengeance. Some of these men had witnessed their comrades' demise at Yehuling. Many of them sought escape through mountain passages, only to be cut down by Mongol cavalry. They were fully aware no clemency would be offered. On the 3rd day, under the personal command of Genghis Khan, 3,000 horsemen launched a direct charge into the Jin defenses. A massive force of 3,000 riders, with the Khan himself leading the vanguard, followed by the rest of the Mongol army. The Jin line, already weakened by 3 days of relentless combat and utterly demoralized after witnessing their main army's destruction at Yehuling, simply shattered. The entire remaining Jin army was obliterated. It wasn't merely defeated, but annihilated, a term explicitly used in historical accounts. Any survivors from the Jin Northern Field Army after Yehuling met their end at Huhe. Wan Chongyu, the chancellor responsible for planning the entire defense, barely escaped with his life. He would continue to serve the Jin dynasty for several more years, but his military career was effectively over. Recovery from losing 400,000 troops in 2 successive battles is impossible. Consider the strategic implications. Within approximately 2 months, from August to October 1211, the Jin dynasty lost its entire northern field army, not just most or half of it, but the entirety. Every significant formation meant to protect northern China from invasion vanished. More than half of the Jin Empire's elite soldiers perished. The military infrastructure, which had taken decades to establish, was ruined in just 8 weeks. The route to Beijing lay open. The Jin capital at Zhongdu possessed some garrison troops and existing city defenses, but no field army remained to lift a siege. There was no mobile force capable of threatening Mongol supply lines or compelling a retreat. Only the city and its stationed troops awaited the Mongol arrival. The truly devastating aspect, securing the Jin dynasty's long-term doom, was their inability to reconstitute what they had lost. While new soldiers could be conscripted, the experience and cohesion of professional military units could not be recreated. New cavalry could be trained, but replacing horses, which require years to breed and raise, was impossible. New officers could be promoted, but the institutional knowledge of a professional officer corps could not be replaced. The Jin dynasty would endure for another 23 years after Yehuling. They would continue to fight, secure some victories, and successfully defend cities. Yet, they never truly recovered from this blow. The empire that could muster 800,000 troops in 1211 found itself fighting a defensive war against the Mongols and eventually the Song dynasty with a mere fraction of that strength. Each passing year worsened their predicament as they forfeited more territory, resources, and people. Yehuling didn't just cause the Jin dynasty to lose, it shattered the empire's capacity to defend itself. One defector, a single mountain pass, 2 months of conflict, and a dynasty that had governed northern China for a century was now facing extinction. In the months following Hui Fortress, the decline accelerated. The Mongols breached Zhuang Pass using a tactical maneuver that would become their signature. Jebi, a general under Genghis Khan, led a force towards the heavily defended pass, feigning an attack before seemingly panicking and retreating. The eager Jin garrison, keen to destroy a retreating foe, sallied forth in pursuit. Jebi's forces fled for 30 kilometers, then reversed course and annihilated the pursuing army. Zhuang Pass surrendered shortly thereafter. An impregnable fortress guarding the pathway to Beijing fell because its defenders could not resist the urge to chase what appeared to be a defeated adversary. Concurrently, Jebi led another force deep into Manchuria, capturing Khitan, present-day Shenyang. A Khitan warlord named Lu, sensing the prevailing winds, pledged allegiance to Genghis Khan. This marked another instance of an ethnic minority choosing the Mongols over the Jurchens. Lu utilized his Khitan troops to assist the Mongols in conquering all of Manchuria. The entire northeastern sector of the Jin Empire simply switched loyalties. By 1213, Mongol armies were ravaging Hebei and Shanxi provinces. They conducted deep raids into Jin territory, destroying urban centers, seizing resources, and proving that the Jin were incapable of safeguarding their own heartland. Subsequently, they encircled Jiangdu, Beijing, the Jin capital itself. The siege of Jiangdu endured from 1213 to 1215. Within the city, Emperor Shizong, the same emperor who had insulted Genghis Khan in 1210, the one who compared the Jin Empire to the sea and the Mongols to a mere handful of sand, was confronting the repercussions of his hubris. The city faced incessant attacks, supplies dwindled, and the populace suffered from starvation. Then, in an action that perfectly encapsulated the internal dysfunction of the Jin dynasty at this juncture, one of Emperor Shizong's own generals, a man named Hushahu, assassinated him. Hushahu murdered the emperor and placed Shizong's nephew, Xuanzong, on the throne. This upheaval transpired while the city remained under siege, with Mongol forces literally outside its walls, as the Jin experienced a palace coup. The newly crowned monarch, Emperor Xuanzong, assessed the dire circumstances and made a choice that would forever haunt the Jin dynasty. He abandoned the city of Jiangdu, vacating the northern capital to seek refuge in the south, specifically Qiang. This move essentially surrendered the northern half of the Jin Empire, retreating to the central regions of China. He attempted to broker a deal with the Mongol forces, offering a variety of tributes including gold, silk, and horses. As a gesture of peace, he even arranged for his daughter, Princess Kigo, to marry Genghis Khan. For a brief period, it seemed a temporary peace might be possible. However, this truce was short-lived. Neither the Mongols nor the Jin had any confidence in the other. When the Jin executed several Mongol envoys, Genghis Khan seized this as a pretext to reignite the conflict. By 1215, the Mongols had returned to Jiangdu, placing it under siege once more. This time, the assault was spearheaded by former Jin generals. Shi Moming, the Khitan defector who had provided crucial intelligence to the Mongols before Yehuling, now led troops against his previous masters. Two other Khitan commanders, Yelu Ahai and Yelu Tahua, also commanded sections of the Mongol forces. During the siege, a Jin general named Puchijin even defected with his entire contingent of troops, joining the Mongol side. The city inevitably fell. The Mongols utterly razed Jiangdu, reducing the Jin dynasty's capital, once a magnificent city in medieval China, to mere smoldering ruins. The survivors, those who escaped death or enslavement, dispersed. While the Jin dynasty's political core was obliterated, the dynasty itself persisted. Emperor Xuanzong continued his rule from Qiang in the south. The Jin still controlled significant territories in central China, possessing armies, resources, and a substantial population. They continued their struggle for an additional 19 years, from 1215 to 1234, even securing some victories. In 1229 and 1230, Jin forces achieved notable successes against Mongol offenses. Though not entirely helpless, they never reclaimed the strategic advantage squandered at Yehuling. The population of northern China, which stood at approximately 45 million in 1200, plummeted to less than 20 million by 1234. This decline wasn't solely due to direct casualties of war. Many fled south into Song territory, and others succumbed to famine and disease. Nevertheless, it represented a catastrophic demographic collapse. The economic foundation of the Jin Empire crumbled. Tax revenues vanished, and the agricultural surplus that sustained their armies disappeared. Genghis Khan passed away in 1227 during a campaign against the Western Shah. However, the war against the Jin persisted under his son and successor, Ogedei Khan. By the early 1230s, the Mongols initiated a coordinated three-pronged offensive on Qiang. The Jin army, still numerous but weary and disheartened, confronted them at Mount Yu. They fought with the desperation of a people facing imminent annihilation. Yet, the Mongols employed shrewd tactics. They avoided direct confrontations, instead luring Jin forces into ambushes and disrupting their supply lines, forcing the Jin into a starving retreat. In 1232, during the Battle of Three-Peaked Hill, a blizzard struck amidst the fighting, causing men to freeze to death in their armor. The Jin troops, already exhausted and famished, completely disintegrated. By 1234, the last Jin emperor committed suicide as Mongol and Song forces converged on the final Jin strongholds. The Mongol-Song alliance, a partnership of former adversaries united against a common foe, crushed the remaining resistance. The Jin dynasty was eradicated from existence. 119 years of Jurchen dominion over northern China concluded. The territory was subsequently divided between the Mongols and the Song. Although the Mongols would eventually subjugate the Song as well, establishing the Yuan dynasty that governed all of China, the genesis of these events can be traced back to August 1211 and the mountain pass known as Yehuling. It was there that the Jin lost their primary army, effectively forfeiting their capacity to defend their territory. It was there that a Khitan defector provided the Mongols with the vital intelligence needed to annihilate 400,000 men in a single engagement. Everything that followed, the sieges, the raids, the demographic decline, the ultimate destruction in 1234, was a direct consequence, not the initial cause. The Jin dynasty effectively perished at Yehuling. It simply took 23 more years for its complete demise. So, to revisit our initial question, how did 100,000 Mongols on foot manage to defeat 400,000 Jin defenders in terrain specifically chosen to impede them? I'll provide the answer up front, and then we'll delve into the specifics. The Mongols triumphed because the inherent advantages of the Jin dynasty transformed into disadvantages once the actual combat began. Superior numbers, defensive terrain, and meticulously prepared positions, all factors that should have rendered the Jin invincible, paradoxically weakened them. The underlying reason for this is a challenge that military leaders still grapple with today. When you prioritize and optimize for a single variable while neglecting all others, you inadvertently create vulnerabilities that remain unseen until they lead to your undoing. Let's begin with the numbers. The Jin boasted 400,000 troops, while the Mongols had perhaps 100,000, a 4-to-1 advantage in favor of the Jin, representing overwhelming numerical superiority. However, a critical point often overlooked is that numerical superiority is only advantageous when forces can be concentrated and their actions synchronized. In an open environment with clear visibility and seamless communication, A contingent of 400,000 soldiers can readily provide mutual support, reinforce vulnerable points, and overwhelm adversaries through sheer volume. Yet, in mountainous regions, where units are dispersed across peaks and valleys, devoid of line of sight, and where communication takes considerable time, those 400,000 troops fragment into numerous isolated groups incapable of assisting one another. Consider this analogy. Would it be preferable to engage in 100 distinct skirmishes, each involving 4,000 of your soldiers against 1,000 of the enemy's, or to participate in a single large-scale battle where an equal force of 100,000 confronts 100,000? Mathematically, the former scenario grants a 4-to-1 advantage in each individual engagement. However, the latter option is genuinely more effective because it permits the consolidation of power, strategic coordination, and the integration of various combat elements. The Jin Dynasty erred by believing that a larger, dispersed army was superior to a smaller, concentrated force at a decisive location. That pivotal location was wherever Genghis Khan chose to strike, as his superior intelligence allowed him to pinpoint the optimal attack points. This leads to the second crucial element, Yuan Chongyu's defection. The Jin dispatched an envoy to gather intelligence on the Mongols. Instead, the Mongols swayed this envoy, thereby gaining comprehensive intelligence on the Jin. This scenario highlights the perils of constructing a multi-ethnic empire through conquest and subsequently entrusting sensitive operations to those subjugated populations. The Jin Dynasty, though governed by Gurkhans, depended on Khitan, Han Chinese, and other ethnic groups to staff its bureaucracy and military, as the Gurkhans alone lacked sufficient manpower. This is not inherently a flaw. Empires like the Roman and Ottoman successfully incorporated conquered peoples. Nevertheless, true integration is required, not merely oppression and an expectation of unwavering loyalty. For 86 years, the Jin Dynasty treated the Khitans as second-class citizens, while simultaneously relying on Khitan officials and soldiers. When the crisis erupted, several Khitan leaders, including Yuan Chongyu, Uli, Yelu I, and Yelu Tua, assessed the situation and concluded that the Mongols presented a more favorable alternative. This was not a betrayal of genuine allegiance, but a calculated decision by individuals who had no inherent loyalty to the Jin dynasty to begin with. The Jin forcibly conquered the Khitan Liao dynasty, brutally suppressed Khitan rebellions, and systematically humiliated Khitan aristocratic families. It then came as a surprise when Khitan officials opted for the Mongols, who were also steppe peoples and offered alliance over subjugation, as a preferable alternative to continued Gurzian rule. The third contributing factor was adaptability. The Mongols were primarily cavalry, and mountains are notoriously inhospitable to horse-mounted warfare. Consequently, they simply dismounted and fought on foot. They did not waste weeks attempting to devise methods for cavalry deployment in unsuitable terrain. They did not retreat because the landscape did not favor their conventional tactics. They adapted, fighting as infantry with sufficient effectiveness to breach a fortified defensive position defended by an army 4 times their size. Contrast this with the Jin's reaction. The Jin strategy hinged entirely on the mountains impeding Mongol cavalry. When the Mongols adapted by fighting on foot, the Jin had no contingency plan. Their entire defensive premise was that mountains would halt cavalry, allowing them to secure the passes and ensure victory. When one component of this equation changed, their entire strategy unraveled. Then there is the terrain itself. Yuan Chongyu selected the mountainous region precisely because it restricted Mongol mobility. What he failed to consider was that it equally hampered Jin mobility, even more so, given that the Jin commanded a far larger force requiring greater maneuvering space. The mountains, intended to safeguard the Jin, became obstacles that isolated them from one another. This illustrates the inherent flaw in defensive thinking. Concentrating on the terrain's impact on the enemy while neglecting its effects on one's own forces. Indeed, mountains impede cavalry charges. However, they also obstruct reinforcements, communication, coordination, and mutual support. A smaller force can maintain concentration and coordination in mountains. A massive force, however, must disperse. And when a large force disperses in terrain that inhibits communication, it loses the capacity to operate as a cohesive army. Ultimately, the Jin based every decision on countering Mongol strengths without considering how those choices compromised their own advantages. They selected terrain that neutralized Mongol cavalry, but simultaneously negated their own numerical superiority. They concentrated 400,000 troops in an area where such a large force could not effectively coordinate. They put their faith in a Khitan official for an intelligence mission, failing to consider that Khitan officials might not be loyal to the Gurchan rulers. Their defensive strategy was rigid, lacking any backup plans or adaptability. Conversely, Genghis Khan made every strategic choice based on exploiting the Jin's vulnerabilities. He prioritized gathering information before launching any offensives. He patiently waited weeks for crucial intelligence instead of rushing into a blind assault. His target was precise: the central command at Hanazui, where a breakthrough would cause maximum chaos. He tailored his tactics to the landscape instead of lamenting that the environment didn't suit his preferred methods. He leveraged existing ethnic tensions within the Jin Empire by forging alliances with conquered groups. One side was inflexible, defensive, and overconfident. The other exhibited nimbleness, aggression, and a systematic approach. When these forces clashed at Yehuling, the adaptable side achieved a decisive victory. However, there's a more profound lesson here, one that transcends this particular battle. Your strengths can turn into weaknesses when your adversary adapts more quickly than you do. The Jin's numerical superiority, with 4 times as many troops, became a liability when positioned in terrain where numbers ceased to matter. Their defensive prowess, holding elevated and fortified passes, became a disadvantage when the Mongols concentrated their forces at a single point, rendering scattered Jin units incapable of reinforcement. The Jin's diverse population, comprising multiple ethnic groups, became a weakness when these groups displayed no loyalty and switched allegiances at critical junctures. The Mongols' strength lay in their cavalry mobility, which they readily abandoned when the terrain made it impractical, demonstrating their ability to fight effectively without it. This highlights a crucial distinction. When your primary advantage becomes irrelevant, can you still operate effectively? The Mongols could. The Jin couldn't. This pattern recurs throughout history. In 1940, the French possessed more tanks, superior defensive positions, and numerical advantages over the Germans. Yet they lost because they couldn't adjust when the Germans breached their lines at Sedan, rendering their entire defensive strategy obsolete. The United States and Vietnam commanded overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and technological advantages. These assets proved ineffective in a guerrilla war where the enemy modified tactics to neutralize American strengths. The Soviet Union's presence in Afghanistan boasted numbers, heavy armaments, and control of urban centers. None of this mattered when the Mujahideen fought from the mountains, employing tactics the Soviets couldn't counter. Yehuling serves as a medieval illustration of this phenomenon. The side possessing more of everything loses because they cannot adapt when their advantages become inconsequential. The side with fewer resources triumphs because they are flexible enough to alter their tactics as circumstances evolve. And there's another point. Genghis Khan didn't merely win this battle, he learned from it. The Mongol conquests of China, Central Asia, Russia, and Eastern Europe all employed variations of these same principles. Gather intelligence, exploit political divisions, adapt tactics to terrain, concentrate force at vulnerable points, and maintain flexibility. Yehuling validated the effectiveness of this concept. Everything thereafter was refinement and repetition. The Jin Dynasty optimized its strategy for halting Mongol cavalry in 1211. By 1234, they were eradicated. The Mongols optimized for adapting to whatever they encountered. By 1279, they commanded the largest contiguous land empire in history. Sometimes, having less is advantageous if utilized more effectively. Sometimes, the seemingly perfect defensive position acts as a trap for the defender. And sometimes, the individual you dispatch to spy on your adversary decides they prefer your enemy to you. Let's return to our starting point. August 1211, Hanazui Pass. Chancellor Wan Chengyu stood on that ridge, observing 400,000 Jin troops perfectly arrayed across the mountains. Every pass was covered, every approach defended. They had 4 times as many soldiers as the Mongols. Defensive terrain, prepared positions. On paper, it seemed invincible. Then the Mongols attacked on foot, breached the center, and transformed those mountains into a killing field spanning 50 kilometers. 400,000 men entered, perhaps 200,000 emerged. The remainder perished in valleys, on trails, in constricted passes with no escape and no one to assist them. How did this occur? Not because the Mongols were superhuman warriors, although they were exceptional. Not because they possessed superior weaponry, they didn't. Not because the Jin were cowardly, they fought fiercely and died by the tens of thousands attempting to hold untenable positions. It happened due to 5 converging factors that aligned at precisely the wrong moment for the Jin Dynasty. Intelligence. Shimoming, the Khitan official entrusted with gathering information on the Mongols, instead switched allegiance, providing the Mongol forces with exhaustive details concerning Jin operational sites, chain of command, and vulnerabilities. This single act of desertion supplied Genghis Khan with crucial knowledge regarding optimal attack vectors and the foreseeable outcomes of such assaults. The Mongols showcased remarkable adaptability. Despite being primarily a cavalry force, they fought on foot and triumphed in mountainous terrain, which the Jin had expected to completely halt their advance. In mere hours, they adjusted to topography that was believed to be impassable. While most armies falter when their primary tactical system is rendered ineffective, the Mongols proved proficient in operating without it. Their concentration of power was another decisive factor. A unified force of 100,000 troops overcame 400,000 scattered across the mountains with broken lines of communication. The critical element isn't sheer numbers, but the ability to deploy overwhelming force at the decisive point. Although the Jin had superior numbers, the Mongols achieved an overwhelming concentration of power where it counted most. The very mountains chosen by the Jin to impede Mongol cavalry also hindered their own coordination, reinforcements, and ability to communicate. When selecting defensive territory, one must assess its impact on one's own forces, not solely on the adversary. Wan Chengyu chose terrain that neutralized Mongol strengths, but unknowingly also neutralized Jin strengths. Political fragility also played a significant role. The Jin Dynasty, an empire built through conquest and comprising diverse ethnicities, fractured during the crisis. Conquered populations, like the Khitans, decided they had no loyalty to their Jurchen overlords and defected. An empire's strength is limited by its weakest loyalties, and the Jin possessed numerous such vulnerabilities. These 5 elements converged at Yehuling, annihilating an empire's main army in a single day. All subsequent events, the siege of Beijing, demographic collapse, protracted defensive warfare, and the final destruction in 1234, can be traced back to this battle in August 1211. The Jin dynasty essentially perished at Yehuling. Though its remnants persisted for 23 more years, it was already doomed. This historical lesson extends beyond medieval Chinese history. The experience of Yehuling applies whenever someone presumes their advantages are permanent, their defenses impenetrable, and their strategies infallible. The French believed the Maginot Line was impregnable. Americans assumed overwhelming firepower would secure victory in Vietnam. Soviets thought controlling cities equaled success in Afghanistan. Similarly, the Jin were convinced that 400,000 troops in mountain passes would stop 100,000 Mongol cavalry. They were all mistaken for the same fundamental reason. They optimized for expected scenarios and failed to adapt when reality diverged. They focused excessively on their inherent strengths without considering how circumstances could transform those strengths into liabilities. And they assumed loyalty without earning it, consequently being surprised when their oppressed subjects aligned with the opposing side. Victory in war isn't about numerical superiority. It's about utilizing existing resources more effectively than the enemy. On that August day in 1211, amidst the mountains north of Beijing, Genghis Khan wielded 100,000 men with greater efficacy than the Jin employed 400,000. He acquired superior intelligence, adapted more swiftly, concentrated his forces more efficiently, and exploited political divisions with greater ruthlessness. The resulting victory was so profound, it altered the course of global history. Without Yehuling, perhaps the Jin might have survived, keeping the Mongols contained within Mongolia. With Yehuling, the Jin were condemned, and the Mongols became an unstoppable force. One battle paved the way for the conquest of China, Central Asia, Russia, and Eastern Europe. A single Khitan defector and one mountain pass directly contributed to the formation of the largest land empire in human history. Consider Wan Changyu once more, standing on that ridge. His decisions were rational, grounded in sound military principles. Mountains impede cavalry, true. Defensive positions favor the defender, true. Numerical superiority typically dictates victory, usually true. Yet, he failed to account for the enemy's capacity to adapt faster than he could react. He also overlooked his own communication breakdowns, and he certainly didn't anticipate his own intelligence officer deciding the Jin deserved their fate. Sometimes, despite executing every step perfectly on paper, defeat occurs because paper doesn't factor in defectors, dismounted cavalry, or mountains that can trap one's own forces as effectively as the enemy's. Sometimes, even a perfectly conceived plan collapses due to unforeseen variables. And sometimes, the individual on the ridge watching 400,000 troops deploy is unknowingly witnessing their march into their own demise. That is Yehuling. That is how empires fall. Not necessarily due to inherent weakness, but because their strengths become irrelevant when the adversary changes the rules of engagement. If you found this in-depth exploration of one of history's most devastating battles as captivating as I did, please consider hitting the like button. It truly helps History Explained reach more individuals who appreciate this kind of detailed military historical analysis. For additional narratives exploring conflicts where expected outcomes failed and the underdog triumphed through ingenuity and flexibility, please subscribe and enable notifications. We have a wealth of such content in store. Share your perspective in the comments below. What, in your opinion, constituted the most significant contributory element to the Mongol triumph at Yehuling? Could it have been Shimuming's betrayal, which furnished them with impeccable tactical insights? Perhaps the mountainous terrain paradoxically worked against the Jin forces, ensnaring their own troops. Or was it the Mongols' remarkable versatility, dismounting to engage in ground combat when cavalry tactics proved ineffective? Is there another explanation altogether? I await your reflections. I appreciate you tuning in to History Explained. Catch you in the upcoming episode.